lecture about the 1980s and really kind of using Ronald Reagan to kind of go over some of the major events that you're going to find on the test at the end of the year. And we'll see if we can't cover Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So I think the first thing that's important is to really discuss kind of the election of Reagan and kind of the overall meaning of the Reagan presidency, and then we'll get into some of the details. Ronald Reagan was from California. He was a former actor in the 1940s and early 1950s, and then later he went into politics as a Republican. He kind of was anti-communist and kind of conservative in his values. He believed in tax cuts and supply and demand and allowing capitalism to flourish and kind of free enterprise, and really didn't believe in the welfare state and kind of the government, making people dependent. I guess that would be the way that Republicans might phrase that, on the federal government. So Reagan ran for president in 1980, and he won the primary, and then he went on to beat Jimmy Carter. And the big issue during the 1980 election was the Iranian hostage crisis. And this is an important event. It's usually on the regents exam, and you should know about it. In the late 70s, when Carter was president, there was in Iran a government that was sort of friendly to the United States. The United States had kind of propped this government up, some people might say. It was a westernized government, but they had problems in terms of authoritarianism, and maybe the country, maybe there was some corruption, and maybe some of the people in that country weren't so supportive of the Shah of Iran. So in the late 70s, there was a revolution in Iran. It's called the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And the Shah of Iran escaped Iran and came to the United States. And the United States provided medical care and security for the Shah. And because of that, the students and the new regime in Iran, which was Islamic and fundamental and really maybe some would say anti-Western, stormed the embassy in Tehran, the United States embassy, and took 50 American hostages. And this is at the end of Jimmy Carter's last year in his presidency. It actually, I think the number is 444 days, held these hostages, and every day they're on TV and they're blindfolded, and Carter couldn't rescue them and he couldn't negotiate them out. Now they were released, and I'll just let the facts speak for themselves, on January 20th of 1981. Now if you're a student of politics, January 20th, after an election year, is a big day. That's the day that the new president, Ronald Reagan, was inaugurated. Ronald Reagan changed American politics. Without a doubt, he is seen as one of the more influential American presidents that we've had. We've already mentioned tax cuts, supply and demand. He did cut taxes for all Americans, but his policies emphasized cuts at the higher end, higher incomes, big business. And the reason for this was Reagan argued that this would create a trickle-down effect. This is called trickle-down economics, supply-side economics. There is an aspect of laissez-faire economics. If you remember this, hands-off big business from the industrial age. And the economy did grow under Reagan. At the same time that Reagan was doing that, he was also trying to kind of lessen the welfare state, the amount of money that the federal government was giving to the states to pay for programs like Medicaid. And he didn't touch Medicare, but programs that were designed to allow people to access monies from the federal government. He expanded defense spending, and this is another big aspect of Reagan. Reagan is seen by many historians as being the winner of the Cold War. And in his first term, he expanded the military. He invested in something called Star Wars, which was a militarized space program designed to create a defense shield around the United States that would kind of laser beam and shoot maybe incoming Soviet missiles, changing the nature of the Cold War. Now, it never materialized, but he did invest in that program. And he did become more of a kind of going against Detente in terms of strength and investing money in military and technology and nuclear weapons and these sorts of things. His second term, there was definitely more of an emphasis on Detente, and Reagan is the one who negotiated or talked with Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. And during that process, Gorbachev adopted reforms in the Soviet Union, such as Pestroika, which is an economic reform which allowed for small businesses, I believe, I could be wrong, and Glasnost, which was kind of an opening up of freedom in the Soviet Union. And many historians, and I use that term loosely, but yes, see that as kind of the floodgate that allowed, like we've taught earlier in class, the M&M concept, where if you give somebody with no M&Ms one M&M, i.e. economic freedom or personal freedom, that creates a want and a desire for that natural right. And by the end of Reagan's term, the waters are already moving. When George Bush, one senior, took over, the Berlin Wall fell, and hence the Soviet Union fell, and the Cold War ended. So Reagan is seen as getting kind of a point for that. Other stuff for Reagan. There is another Iranian connection. There was a scandal, I believe 1985, 1986, in his second term, where Reagan is seen as being kind of a strong executive, using executive power, not like Nixon, but the concept of, powerful president between executive and legislative. So in the mid-1980s, the government of Nicaragua was under a threat of communists. These communists were called, I'm getting it backwards. There was a communist regime in Nicaragua, and there was some freedom fighters, Reagan called them freedom fighters, that were called Contras. And he had first gone to Congress in order to get authority to send money to this group of rebels. This is the defense guy, right? The Cold War warrior. Congress was under Democratic hands in the mid-80s and said no to Ronald Reagan. So the story goes, whether Reagan knew or not, people working for Reagan, including Oliver North, now a media personality, and you can hear him on the radio and see him on Fox News, worked with the government of Iran. And this is that Iranian connection that, some people point back to in 1980 with the release of the hostages. But nevertheless, there was a swapping of money and guns between the United States, Iran, and the Contras. The Contras getting their money and their aid, their military aid, through that kind of weird connection. And there was an investigation, and people went to jail. And Reagan claimed that he really wasn't part of that thinking process. And it happened under his watch, but he kind of played it cool. And sometimes he's called the Teflon president, that nothing stuck to Reagan, that he came out scandal-free. And that would be called the IranContra event. I'm peeking at my notes again, and I think that we covered it all. Definitely kind of see him in the light of republicanism. And republicanism, again, is kind of in the 1980s, a social value thing. Abortion and big anti-drug campaign under Reagan, a religious aspect, and a sense of American exceptionalism. He said that America was the shining city on the hill. And I think this goes back to kind of Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny and kind of believing in America. And his commercials are very kind of, patriotic music and kind of a touchy-feely aspect to them. He was called the Great Communicator. He was very powerful at using his presidency in order to convey messages to Americans. And he changed the nature of politics. Before Reagan, much of the South was Democrat. And after Reagan, much of the South is Republican. And that's probably enough for Reagan. I'm checking my time, guys. I think you should be good. I don't think you're probably going to write an essay on Reagan for the Regents, but you should have enough for multiple choice. Again, laissez-faire, supply-side economics, Iran-Contra, defense spending, Soviet Union falls, Reagan is credited, and I think that should be good. So good luck. We'll see you soon for a new lecture. Ronald Reagan. One more thing. Reagan is also, in the Cold War, the president that authorized military aid to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And that's part of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan, partly because the United States aided who the Soviet Union was fighting in Afghanistan. And that later becomes important because the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden, is part of that. And sometimes your enemy's enemy becomes your enemy. And I guess that's a lesson. And I don't know if that can even be fit into the lecture today. Good luck, guys. Mujahideen.